In the heart of a quiet grocery store, Officer Marcus Reed, off duty and blending into the crowd, witnesses a moment that will shatter his view of the badge he wears. A young black cashier is being cornered by a man cloaked in authority, an officer named Jake Laam, whose reputation for intimidation precedes him. But when Marcus steps in to stop Jake's abuse of power, he has no idea he's about to uncover a darkness within his own department, one that may cost him everything he stands for. Marcus Reed adjusted his civilian clothes in the mirror, a ritual he performed every morning before heading out. Even on his day off, the weight of his badge, tucked safely in his wallet, reminded him of who he was and what he stood for. 15 years on the force had taught him that a police officer's duty never truly ends, even when the uniform comes off. The morning sun painted golden streaks across his apartment's worn hardwood floors. Photos lined the walls: his graduation from the police academy, his late father in his military uniform, and various moments with his fellow officers at community events. Each image told a story of service, dedication, and the complex relationship between law enforcement and the community they served. Marcus grabbed his keys, deciding to make a quick run to Wilson's grocery for some essentials. It was supposed to be a simple errand, the kind that punctuated normal days and normal lives. But in his line of work, Marcus had learned that normal was often just the calm before the storm. The familiar bell chimed as he pushed open the store's glass door. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the neat rows of products. Marcus nodded to Mrs. Wilson, the owner's wife, who had known him since he first moved to the neighborhood. She returned his greeting with a warm smile that quickly faded as her eyes darted toward the back of the store. That's when Marcus heard it, the raised voice that carried the unmistakable tone of authority being wielded like a weapon. His instincts, honed by years of experience, immediately kicked in. Following the sound, he rounded the corner of aisle 7 to find a scene that made his blood run cold. Officer Jake Laam, a man Marcus knew by reputation rather than acquaintance, stood towering over a young black cashier. The boy, he couldn't have been more than 19, was trembling, his name tag reading Thomas. Jake's face was flushed with anger, his finger jabbing accusatively at the teenager's chest. "I saw you pocket something." Jake's voice boomed through the store. "Empty your pockets now." Thomas's hands shook as he turned out his empty pockets. "Sir, I didn't take anything. I'm just doing my job. Please." Marcus observed the scene, noting the security cameras overhead and the small crowd of onlookers gathering at a safe distance. He saw fear in Thomas's eyes, a fear he recognized all too well. It was the same fear he'd seen in countless young black men who found themselves at the mercy of law enforcement, guilty or not. Jake grabbed Thomas's arm roughly. "You think I'm stupid? I know your type. Always trying to get away with something." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Your type. The casual racism embedded in those two simple words ignited something in him. He had spent his career trying to bridge gaps, to prove that the badge could represent protection rather than persecution. Now, watching a fellow officer perpetuate the very stereotypes he fought against, Marcus knew he couldn't remain a silent observer. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. "Officer," he called out, his voice calm but firm. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here." Jake's head snapped around, his eyes narrowing at the interruption. He didn't recognize Marcus out of uniform, saw only another black man daring to question his authority. "This doesn't concern you, sir. Step back." But Marcus had already crossed his personal Rubicon. In that moment, He wasn't just Marcus Reed, the off-duty officer. He was every black person who had ever faced unwarranted suspicion, every citizen who had witnessed abuse of power and stayed silent. Not today. Not anymore. Little did he know, this simple trip to the grocery store would spark a chain of events that would challenge everything he believed about brotherhood, justice, and what it truly meant to protect and serve. The thin blue line was about to be tested, and Marcus Reed would find himself at the heart of a storm that had been brewing for years. The fluorescent lights of Wilson's grocery seemed to buzz louder in the tense silence that followed Marcus's intervention. Jake Laam's face twisted with irritation, his hand still gripping Thomas's arm. The young cashier's eyes darted between the two men, hope beginning to replace fear as someone finally stood up for him. "I said step back," Jake repeated, his voice carrying that dangerous edge that Marcus had heard too many times before, the sound of authority being challenged and reacting poorly. Marcus took another step forward instead, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "The young man has shown you his empty pockets," he said, keeping his voice steady. "There are cameras in this store. If there was a theft, it would be on video. Why don't we all take a breath and handle this professionally?" Jake's nostrils flared. The word professionally seemed to strike a particular nerve. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he snarled, releasing Thomas's arm to turn his full attention to Marcus. "This is police business. One more word, and you'll be joining him for obstruction." A small crowd had gathered now, phones raised, recording the confrontation. Marcus could feel the weight of their gazes, the silent prayers for someone to finally stand up to the bullying they'd witnessed too often. He thought of his father's words from years ago, "Son, wearing the badge means protecting people from injustice, even when that injustice wears a badge too." "Officer Laam," Marcus said, reaching slowly for his wallet, "I think we need to discuss your approach to—" He never finished the sentence. Jake, interpreting the movement as a threat, launched forward with frightening speed. His fist connected with Marcus's jaw in a brutal arc, sending him stumbling backward into a display of canned goods. The crash of falling cans echoed through the store, followed by gasps from the onlookers. Marcus tasted blood in his mouth as he steadied himself. Years of training kicked in, but he forced himself to remain calm. With deliberate movements, he reached again for his wallet, this time successfully retrieving it. He flipped it open, revealing the badge that gleamed under the harsh store lights. "Officer Marcus Reed, 15th Precinct," he announced, his voice carrying across the now silent store. "And you, Officer Laam, are under arrest for assault and misconduct." The color drained from Jake's face as the reality of his situation sank in. The crowd's phones captured every moment as Jake's aggressive posture crumbled. Thomas, the forgotten catalyst of this confrontation, sagged with relief against the counter. You're a cop?" Jake stammered, his bravado evaporating. "Yes," Marcus replied, touching his swelling jaw. "And you just assaulted a fellow officer while harassing an innocent civilian. Now, are we going to handle this professionally, or do I need to call for backup?" The next few minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Marcus recited Jake's rights as he cuffed him, the metal bracelets clicking shut with a finality that echoed through the store. He could see the mixture of shock and shame on Jake's face, not necessarily for his actions, Marcus suspected, but for having chosen the wrong target for his prejudice. As Marcus led Jake out of the store, he paused by Thomas. "Are you okay, son?" The young man nodded, still shaking slightly. "Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you for stepping in." "I'll need your statement," Marcus said gently. "And the security footage. We're going to make sure this is handled properly." Outside, the morning sun seemed impossibly bright, illuminating a scene that would soon become the talk of the department and the catalyst for change. As Marcus waited for a patrol car to transport Jake, he knew this was just the beginning. The real battle, the one that would take place within the precinct walls, was about to begin. The thin blue line had been crossed, not by exposing misconduct, but by allowing it to exist in the first place. As Marcus watched the patrol car arrive, lights flashing in the morning sun, he steeled himself for what was to come. Sometimes, he reflected, the greatest acts of loyalty to the badge came from being willing to hold it accountable. The 15th precinct buzzed with an electric tension when Marcus walked through its doors the next morning. The usual morning greetings died in throats, replaced by weighted silence and darting glances. News traveled fast in law enforcement circles, and the video of yesterday's confrontation had already made its rounds through department phones and social media. Marcus felt the stares as he made his way to his desk. The bruise on his jaw had darkened to a deep purple, a visible reminder of yesterday's events. Officer Sarah Chen, his partner of 3 years, was the first to approach him. "Hell of a day off, partner," she said, placing a cup of coffee on his desk. Her eyes reflected concern as she studied his injury. "You okay?" Before Marcus could respond, Detective Mike Sullivan walked past, deliberately bumping Marcus's desk with his hip. Coffee sloshed over the rim of the cup. "Oops," Sullivan muttered, not bothering to look back. "My bad." The message was clear. Lines were being drawn. Marcus grabbed some tissues to clean up the spill, his movements measured and calm. He'd expected this. The subtle acts of hostility, the silent treatment, the us versus them mentality that emerged whenever an officer broke ranks. What surprised him was how many of his colleagues seemed to be choosing sides without knowing the full story. Captain Julia Hayes's voice cut through the tension. "Reed, my office. Now." The walk to her office felt longer than usual. Marcus could feel eyes following him, could almost hear the whispered conversations that would start the moment he was out of earshot. Inside the captain's office, the atmosphere shifted from hostile to something more complex. Hayes gestured to a chair as she closed the door. "That's quite a shiner you're sporting, Reed." She settled behind her desk, her expression unreadable. "I've reviewed the preliminary reports and the video footage. Want to tell me what happened?" For the next 15 minutes, Marcus detailed the events at Wilson's grocery. Hayes listened without interruption, her fingers steepled under her chin. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair with a heavy sigh. "You did the right thing," she said finally, surprising him with her directness. "But you've stirred up a hornet's nest. Jake Laam has friends in the department, friends in the union. They're already trying to spin this as an unfortunate misunderstanding between officers." Misunderstanding? Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He was harassing an innocent kid based on nothing but racial prejudice. Then he assaulted a fellow officer. Where's the misunderstanding in that? Hayes held up a hand. "I'm on your side here, Reed. But you need to understand what you're up against. Internal Affairs is launching a full investigation. They'll be interviewing everyone involved, including the store employees and witnesses. Until then, things are going to be difficult. As if to emphasize her point, raised voices could be heard from the bullpen. Through the office window, Marcus saw Officer Rodriguez arguing with Sullivan, their gestures animated and angry. "See what I mean?" Hayes said quietly. "This incident isn't just about you and Laam anymore. It's bringing up every unspoken tension, every buried resentment in the department. Some officers see you as a hero standing up against abuse of power. Others," she trailed off meaningfully, "others see me as a traitor," Marcus finished. "Exactly." Hayes stood up, moving to look out at the bullpen. The thin blue line. It's supposed to represent brotherhood, unity, and protecting the public. But somewhere along the way, some officers started seeing it as a wall of silence, protecting our own no matter what. She turned back to face him. "You didn't just cross that line yesterday, Reed. You showed everyone how broken it really is." A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Chun poked her head in. "Captain, the chief is here. He wants to speak with both of you." Hayes straightened her uniform. "Already? That was faster than I expected." She looked at Marcus. "Whatever happens next, stand your ground. We need more officers like you, Reed. Ones who remember that the badge means protecting everyone, not just each other." As they prepared to meet with the chief, Marcus caught his reflection in the office window. The bruise on his face told one story, but it was the determination in his eyes that told another. He had chosen his path yesterday in that grocery store, and despite the cost, despite the isolation and hostility, he knew he would choose the same path again. The real test was just beginning, and Marcus Reed was ready to face whatever came next, not just for himself, but for every officer who had ever struggled with the choice between what was right and what was easy. Chief Alan Montgomery's office felt smaller than usual, despite its impressive size. The morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the polished desk where files lay spread open. Incident reports, witness statements, and stills from the security footage that had now gone viral. Marcus sat straight-backed in one of the leather chairs, Captain Hayes beside him, as Montgomery reviewed the documents for what seemed like the 100th time. The chief's reputation for thoroughness was legendary, matched only by his commitment to departmental integrity. "Officer Reed," Montgomery finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of service. "Do you know why I started in law enforcement?" The question caught Marcus off guard. "No, sir." Montgomery stood, walking to a framed photo on his wall, a much younger version of himself, standing beside an elderly black man in front of a small convenience store. "This was Mr. Johnson. He owned a shop in my neighborhood when I was a rookie. One night, some officers roughed him up during a so-called routine inspection. Nobody did anything about it. Nobody said a word." He turned back to face Marcus. "That's when I knew things had to change." The chief returned to his desk, picking up the incident report. "Your actions at Wilson's Grocery have forced this department to face some uncomfortable truths. The internal review board is under immense pressure. Half want to bury this, claim it was a misunderstanding between officers. The other half want to make an example of Officer Laam." "And what do you want, sir?" Marcus asked quietly. Montgomery's eyes met his. "I want justice, Reed. The same thing you want. But justice isn't always simple, is it?" Before anyone could respond, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Lieutenant Garcia from Internal Affairs. She entered carrying a thick folder, her expression professionally neutral. "Chief, we've completed our preliminary investigation," she announced, placing the folder on his desk. "The security footage confirms Officer Reed's account completely. We also have 17 witness statements, all corroborating the sequence of events. Additionally," she hesitated, glancing at Marcus, "we've uncovered 6 previous complaints against Officer Laam for excessive force and racial profiling. All were dismissed without thorough investigation." The room grew heavy with the weight of this revelation. Captain Hayes leaned forward, her face tightening. 6 complaints? How did those slip through? "You know how," Montgomery said grimly. "The same way they always do. The thin blue line becomes a wall of silence." He opened the folder, scanning its contents. But not this time. The next hour was intense. The chief methodically went through every detail of the incident, asking pointed questions about Marcus's decisions, his observations of Laam's behavior, and his thoughts on departmental reform. Marcus answered honestly, even when the truth was uncomfortable. "Officer Reed," Montgomery said finally, closing the folder, "you're aware that some officers view your actions as a betrayal of brotherhood?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied. "But I took an oath to protect and serve everyone, not just other officers. If upholding that oath makes me a traitor in some eyes, I can live with that." A slight smile crossed Montgomery's face. "Good answer." He stood, signaling the meeting's end. "Lieutenant Garcia, I want a full audit of all dismissed complaints against our officers for the past 5 years. Captain Hayes, prepare a department-wide briefing. It's time we had an honest conversation about accountability." As they stood to leave, Montgomery called Marcus back. "Reed, one more thing. The next few weeks won't be easy. There will be officers who won't work with you, who'll try to make your life difficult. But know this, you did exactly what I expect from every officer wearing this badge. You stood up for what's right, regardless of the cost." Walking back to his desk, Marcus felt a strange mix of vindication and apprehension. The internal review was just beginning, and its ripples would touch every corner of the department. His phone buzzed with a message. Thomas, the young cashier from Wilson's Grocery, thanking him again for his intervention. That simple message reminded Marcus why he'd become an officer in the first place. Not for the badge, not for the brotherhood, but for the Thomas Johnsons of the world who needed someone to stand up for them. The precinct hummed with tension as news of the internal review spread. Marcus could feel the shifting alliances, the whispered conversations, the weighing of loyalties. But as he sat at his desk, he realized something important. Sometimes the greatest test of loyalty isn't staying silent to protect your own, but having the courage to speak up and protect what's right. Jake Laam sat across from Marcus in the department's conference room, looking considerably different from the aggressive officer at Wilson's Grocery. His uniform was replaced by civilian clothes, his swagger diminished by the weight of consequences. Between them sat Dr. Sarah Martinez, the department's newly appointed diversity and bias counselor. "Officer Laam, Dr. Martinez began, her voice steady and professional. "Would you like to share your thoughts about the incident?" Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes fixed on the table. The mandatory counseling sessions were part of his disciplinary action, along with a suspension and required bias training. "I screwed up," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I let my assumptions cloud my judgment." Marcus watched his colleague struggle with the admission. The bruise on his jaw had faded to a yellowish tinge, but the memory remained fresh. Assumptions, he repeated quietly. Let's call it what it was, Jake. Racial bias. Jake's head snapped up, a flash of the old anger in his eyes, but it quickly subsided under Dr. Martinez's steady gaze. Fine, he conceded. Racial bias. I saw a young black man behind the counter and I automatically assumed the worst. And when Officer Reed intervened, Dr. Martinez prompted. I didn't see a fellow officer, Jake admitted, shame coloring his words. I just saw another black man challenging my authority. God, saying it out loud. He ran his hands over his face. I've been on the force for 12 years. I always told myself I was one of the good ones, you know? That I treated everyone the same. Marcus leaned forward. Those 6 complaints against you tell a different story, Jake. This wasn't an isolated incident. The revelation hung heavy in the air. Jake's face paled. He hadn't known about the audit of past complaints. 6? All involving minorities, Marcus confirmed. All dismissed without proper investigation. That ends now. Dr. Martinez observed their exchange with keen interest. Officer Laam, recognition is the first step. But what matters now is how you choose to move forward. Jake was quiet for a long moment, seemingly wrestling with internal demons. My father was a cop, he finally said. Old school. He had certain views about people. I grew up with those views, absorbed them without questioning. But that's not an excuse, is it? No, Marcus replied. It's not. But it is a starting point for change. The conversation shifted to concrete actions. Dr. Martinez outlined the comprehensive bias training program that Jake, and eventually the entire department would undergo. It wasn't just about recognizing prejudice. It was about actively working to dismantle it. As they wrapped up the session, Jake stood awkwardly. Reed, he called as Marcus reached the door. I'm sorry, not just for hitting you, but for everything. Marcus studied him for a moment. Prove it, he said simply, not with words, but with actions. Later that afternoon, Marcus found himself in Chief Montgomery's office again. The chief was reviewing the progress reports from the internal audit. The numbers are worse than we thought, Montgomery admitted, pushing a document across his desk. Patterns of bias, excessive force, dismissed complaints. It's all here in black and white. Marcus scanned the statistics, his heart heavy. We can't bury this, sir. No, we can't, Montgomery agreed. And we won't. I've scheduled a press conference for tomorrow. We're going to acknowledge our failures publicly and outline our plan for reform. The news spread through the precinct like wildfire. Marcus could feel the tension rising, but something was different now. Officers who had initially shunned him were beginning to approach, some sharing their own stories of witnessed misconduct they'd stayed silent about. Officer Chen found him at his desk as evening approached. The thin blue line isn't disappearing, she said, perching on the edge of his desk. It's just being redrawn in the right place, between right and wrong, not between us and them. Marcus nodded, thinking about Jake's counseling session, the upcoming reforms, and the long road ahead. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it was happening. Sometimes it took a single moment, a confrontation in a grocery store, to crack the foundation of long-standing prejudices. As he prepared to leave for the day, Marcus passed the precinct's wall of honor, where the department's motto hung, to protect and serve. For the first time in weeks, those words didn't feel like an empty promise. They felt like a commitment being renewed, one honest conversation at a time. The community center on Oak Street was packed beyond capacity. Marcus stood at the back, watching as people filled every available space. Community members, activists, officers in uniform, and civilians alike. The town hall meeting had been organized in response to the viral video of the Wilson's grocery incident, but it had evolved into something much larger. Reverend James Turner, a respected civil rights leader, stood at the podium. What Officer Reed did wasn't just about stopping one incident of bias, his voice carried through the room. It was about acknowledging a systemic problem that has plagued our community for generations. From his position, Marcus could see the divided reactions in the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Near the front, Thomas, the young cashier from Wilson's grocery, sat with his family, his presence a powerful reminder of why this conversation mattered. This is nothing but an attack on law enforcement. The shout came from somewhere in the middle of the room. A middle-aged man stood up, his face red with anger. One incident, and suddenly all cops are racist? What about the good officers who risk their lives every day? Before anyone could respond, Officer Sarah Chon stepped forward. "Nobody's saying all cops are racist," she said firmly. "We're saying that when we see bias or misconduct, we have a duty to stop it. That's what makes a good officer." The tension in the room was palpable. Marcus watched as Maria Rodriguez, a local community organizer, took the microphone. "For years, we've been told to trust the system," she said, her voice steady. "But trust has to be earned." What Officer Reed did, standing up against injustice within his own department, that's how trust begins. As the discussion continued, Marcus noticed something remarkable happening. People who had entered the room on opposite sides were actually listening to each other. A veteran officer shared his struggles with witnessing misconduct, but feeling powerless to stop it. A young activist spoke about her fear during police encounters, while acknowledging the complexity of law enforcement's role in the community. During a break in the proceedings, Marcus found himself surrounded by a small group of community leaders. Among them was Diana Washington, head of the local Civil Rights Coalition. "We need more than just conversations, Officer Reed," she said, her eyes intense. "We need concrete changes in policy, in training, in accountability." Marcus nodded. "I agree. That's why I've been working with Chief Montgomery on a comprehensive reform proposal. But we need community input and support to make it work." "You'll have it," Reverend Turner assured him, joining the conversation. "But be prepared. Not everyone wants change. Some people are invested in maintaining the status quo." As if to prove his point, a group of officers near the entrance were huddled together, throwing disapproving glances their way. Marcus recognized several of them as members of the police union's old guard. The second half of the town hall focused on solutions. Marcus presented the department's new initiatives, enhanced bias training, community oversight committees, and transparent complaint investigation procedures. Each point sparked intense discussion, but the tone had shifted from confrontational to constructive. Thomas approached the microphone, his voice slightly shaky but determined. "Before what happened at the store, I never thought an officer would stand up for someone like me against another cop. Officer Reed showed me that change is possible, but only if we're brave enough to demand it." As the meeting drew to a close, Marcus found himself in conversation with an unlikely alliance. Police officers, community activists, religious leaders, and local residents, all united in their commitment to reform. They exchanged contact information, planned future meetings, and began forming working groups to address specific issues. Outside the community center, the evening air was cool and fresh. Marcus watched as people lingered in small groups, continuing their discussions. Officer Chun appeared at his side. "You've started something bigger than yourself? You know that, right?" she said, gesturing to the diverse crowd. "This isn't just about one incident anymore. It's about reimagining what police-community relations could be." Marcus thought about the long road ahead, the resistance they'd face, the hard conversations still to come, the systemic changes needed. But looking at the impromptu coalitions forming around him, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a while: hope. "Change happens one conversation at a time," he replied, watching as Thomas and his family chatted with a group of officers. "And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say this isn't right to start those conversations." The community center's lights dimmed, but the energy of the evening lingered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight had shown that when people were willing to listen and work together, real change was possible. The thin blue line was being redrawn, not as a barrier between police and community, but as a bridge connecting them. The morning newspaper sat on Marcus's desk, its headline bold and unavoidable. Police department faces internal strife over reform measures. Below it, a photo showed Chief Montgomery at yesterday's press conference, announcing sweeping changes to departmental policies. Marcus's own face appeared in a smaller photo beside it, labeled Catalyst for Change. Captain Hayes appeared at his desk, coffee in hand. "Ready for today?" she asked, her expression serious. "The union meeting's going to be rough." Marcus nodded, gathering his materials. The police union had called an emergency meeting to discuss, and likely oppose, the new accountability measures. As he walked toward the conference room, he could feel the weight of eyes following him, some supportive, others hostile. The room was already tense when they arrived. Union President Mike Callahan stood at the front, his face set in stern lines. Behind him, a projection showed statistics about officer morale and resignation rates from departments that had implemented similar reforms. "This isn't just about one incident anymore," Callahan began, his voice carrying authority earned over 20 years of service. "These new policies put every officer at risk. One mistake, one split-second decision, and our careers are over." Marcus felt the familiar surge of frustration. "This isn't about punishing mistakes," he interjected, standing. "It's about addressing systematic bias and abuse of power. There's a difference between a split-second decision and a pattern of misconduct." Officer Rodriguez, a veteran of 15 years, spoke up from the back. "I've got 3 kids to feed. Now we're supposed to second-guess every decision because someone might film it and call us racist?" The room erupted in murmurs of agreement, but Officer Chan stood her ground beside Marcus. "We already should be thinking about every decision we make," she argued. "That's what it means to serve and protect." The debate grew heated. Officers divided into clear factions, those supporting reform and those resistant to change. Marcus noticed Jake Laam sitting quietly in the corner, his expression troubled as he watched the confrontation unfold. Suddenly, the door opened, and Thomas entered with his father, Mr. Wilson from the grocery store, and several other community members. The room fell silent. "Sorry to interrupt," Thomas said, his voice stronger than it had been at the town hall meeting. "But we were invited to share our perspective." Captain Hayes nodded, having arranged their presence. "Please continue." Mr. Wilson stepped forward, his dignity evident in every movement. "I've owned my store for 30 years, he began. "In that time, I've seen good officers and bad ones. But what I've never seen, until Officer Reed stood up that day, was an officer willing to hold another accountable in the moment. That's not attacking the police, that's making the police better." The tension in the room shifted. Jake Laam suddenly stood up, his voice rough with emotion. "He's right," he said, surprising everyone. "I was wrong that day, and I've been wrong many times before. These reforms, they're not about punishment. They're about making us the officers we claimed to be when we took the oath." Marcus watched as the dynamic in the room began to change. Officers who had been staunchly opposed to reform began asking questions about implementation rather than just rejecting the idea outright. Others shared their own experiences of witnessing misconduct but feeling powerless to intervene. Near the end of the meeting, Callahan called for a union vote on the reforms. The room held its breath as hands were counted. The final tally was close, but the reforms passed. It wasn't unanimous, but it was a start. As people filed out, Officer Rodriguez approached Marcus. "My kids," she said quietly. "I want them to be proud when they tell people their mom's a cop. Maybe these changes will help with that." Later that evening, Marcus found himself back at Wilson's grocery. The store was closing up, but Thomas waved him in. They talked about the union meeting, about change, about hope. "You know what's funny?" Thomas said, restocking shelves. "Before all this, I wanted to be a lawyer because I thought that was the only way to fight for justice. Now I'm thinking about the police academy." Marcus helped him with a heavy box, considering the weight of those words. "The department will be different by then," he said. "Better, I hope." "Because people like you stayed to make it better," Thomas replied. Walking back to his car, Marcus reflected on the day's events. The price of change was high. Broken friendships, tense workdays, constant scrutiny. But as he watched Thomas lock up the store, greeting officers on evening patrol with a wave instead of fear, he knew it was worth every cost. His phone buzzed with a message from Chief Montgomery. "Tomorrow, 8 a.m. Time to implement these changes." Marcus smiled, ready for whatever came next. The thin blue line hadn't been erased. It had been transformed into something better, something truer to their original oath to protect and serve. 6 months had passed since the Wilson's grocery incident. Marcus stood in front of the newest police academy class, scanning the eager faces before him. Among them sat Thomas Wilson, who had indeed followed through on his decision to join the force. The young man caught his eye and smiled, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. "Your training manual lists the technical requirements of being a police officer," Marcus began, pacing slowly across the front of the classroom. "But today, I want to talk about something that won't be on your exams, the courage to stand up for what's right, especially when the person you're standing up to wears the same badge you do." The room was silent, all eyes fixed on him. Through the classroom window, he could see the department's newly installed transparency board, a public display showing complaint statistics, use of force incidents, and resolution outcomes. It was just one of many changes implemented over the past months. Officer Reed? A cadet raised her hand. We heard about what happened at Wilson's grocery. Weren't you afraid of the backlash? Marcus paused, considering the question. Of course I was, he admitted. But fear shouldn't stop us from doing what's right. That incident wasn't just about one officer's misconduct. It was about choosing what kind of department, what kind of community we want to be. As if on cue, Jake Laam appeared at the classroom door. He was now part of the department's new accountability training team, a position he'd requested after completing his suspension and rehabilitation program. Mind if I join? Jake asked, stepping into the room. The cadets straightened in their seats, recognizing him from the viral video that had circulated months ago. Officer Laam and I have a unique perspective to share, Marcus explained. We've seen both sides of this issue, the resistance to change and the necessity of it. Jake moved to stand beside Marcus, a position that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. I was the problem, he said frankly to the cadets. I represented everything that needed to change in law enforcement. But thanks to Officer Reed's intervention, I got a chance to change, to be better. The next hour passed quickly as they shared their experiences with the cadets. They talked about the department's transformation, the new community oversight board, the mandatory bias training, the peer intervention program. But more importantly, they spoke about the changing culture within the force. After class, Marcus walked through the precinct, noting the differences. The wall that had once displayed only officer commendations now included community feedback and partnership achievements. Officer Chin was leading a diversity task force, and Captain Hayes had been promoted to deputy chief, focusing on reform implementation. In the break room, he found Chief Montgomery talking with Mr. Wilson and several other community leaders who were now regular visitors to the department. They were discussing the latest statistics. Complaints down by 40%, community trust metrics improving, and notably, a more diverse pool of police academy applicants. Reed, Montgomery called him over. We were just talking about expanding the program to other departments. Several cities have reached out, wanting to implement our reforms. Marcus nodded, thinking about how far they'd come. The changes hadn't been easy. They'd lost some officers who couldn't accept the new direction, faced resistance from old guard politicians, and weathered intense public scrutiny. But they'd gained something more valuable: integrity and trust. Later that evening, Marcus made his usual stop at Wilson's grocery. The store had become a symbol of change in the community, and Mr. Wilson had turned one wall into a community bulletin board where police updates and community events were posted side by side. As he grabbed his usual coffee, he noticed a new officer handling a situation outside. One of the recent academy graduates. The officer was talking to a group of teenagers, not with suspicion or authority, but with respect and genuine interest. The teens were responding in kind, the interaction a small but significant sign of shifting dynamics. His phone buzzed with a message from Thomas. Last day at the store. Academy graduation tomorrow. Thanks for showing me what's possible. Marcus smiled, remembering his own academy graduation, how full of hope and purpose he'd been. That purpose hadn't diminished. It had evolved, grown stronger through challenge and change. Outside, the sun was setting on another day in the department. The thin blue line remained, but it had been redefined. No longer was it a barrier between us and them, or a symbol of silent complicity. Instead, it had become what it should have been all along: a line between right and wrong, justice and injustice, drawn and maintained by officers and community members working together. As Marcus headed home, he passed the department's newly painted motto, "To protect, serve, and stand for justice." Below it, in smaller letters, were words that had become their informal creed. Change starts with one person willing to stand up. The story of Marcus Reed and the Wilson's grocery incident would be told to future academy classes, not just as a cautionary tale about bias, but as proof that positive change was possible. One moment of courage, one decision to stand up, had created ripples that continued to transform not just their department, but the very nature of policing in their community. And somewhere in the city, a new officer was facing their own moment of truth, armed with the training, support, and courage to do what was right. The thin blue line had been redrawn, and this time, it pointed toward justice.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.